She's covered war and conflict and its devastating aftermath in Ukraine, Syria, Iraq and Gaza, and shone a spotlight on women's struggles in India and Egypt, with her images appearing in the likes of Le Monde, Libération, The Washington Post, Newsweek and Stern Magazine. And she's back here in France for the Rencontres Festival. Our guest for Perspective is award-winning photographer Chloe Sharrock. Chloe, thank you so much for being with us here on the programme this morning. Firstly, how long have you spent covering the war in Ukraine? And just talk to us a little bit about how difficult that may have been for you. Some of your photos, they're quite hard to look at in terms of their graphic nature, but also the intimacy of some of the shots. Just talk to us a little bit about your time in Ukraine.
First by going to Romania and then covering Ukraine. And I've last came back from Ukraine a couple of months ago. So I basically covered the entire conflict since the 24th of February. But so yeah, and then I went pretty much everywhere in the east, in the west, in the south, in pretty much everywhere that we could be going in Ukraine.
And how difficult has it been for you to do that? Just, as I said, some of those images, they're fairly graphic, just in terms of being so close to what's happening during the conflict. Just give us an example of how that feels to be there on the front line, essentially, as you seem to be judging from some of your photographs.
I mean, it was very hard because for me as well, as a very young photographer, it was the very first time that I was covering a conflict directly. And I think it was such a historical event. That we would really see everything unfolding in front of our eyes, and we were trying to, try to understand what was happening at the same time. And the entire conflict was just so shocking at the very beginning of it. I think maybe one of the most difficult moments were when there were all those first, crimes in Bucha and everything that were finally being uncovered. So seeing what the Russian soldiers were actually doing to civilians, and the brutality of everything, and how this went. So yeah.
And Chloe, just your work as a war photographer, do you find it difficult to remain objective, or do you think that part of your job is essentially to take sides? You're speaking there about the brutality of Russian troops, just in terms of what was actually happening as you viewed it in Ukraine.
I honestly don't believe in the perfect objectivity of journalists. I think that just by choosing to cover a story, we are already taking sides. But I think one of the specificity of the war in Ukraine is that it's not even possible to actually go on the Russian side. So as journalists, we can only cover the Ukrainian side. If we were to decide to actually cover the Russian side, we would not be allowed to actually cover again the Ukrainian side afterwards. So I think that's one of the very, very small specificity of this conflict. It's we can only cover one side. But then again, I don't think that as journalists we are actually completely objective. I mean, usually we are doing this because we believe in some ideas and because we want to highlight some very, very specific stories. And I think that just by actually deciding to cover something, we are already taking sides in one way.
And is that what drew you to the career in the first place?
Yeah, I think so. I think very, very young, I was very shocked by injustice and also very fascinated by violence in some way. I really always struggled understanding why human being was so violent, and why, people why human being was just, where was the violence coming from and what was the essence of violence. And I think everything that has to do with my work is about trying to get a better understanding of every form of violence. So this time it was in Ukraine for a very specific conflict. But before that, I worked, for example, on women's rights and violence against women. It could also be in, post-conflictual countries, so about also violences and the way the countries were trying to reconstruct themselves afterwards. But yeah, I think it's because violence is everywhere, and And I think it's important to try to understand where it's coming from and how.
And have you come to an understanding about that? Like, where do you feel this violence is coming from? And perhaps what have you learned about the human experience of conflict?
I think very sadly, I just realized that violence is everywhere, and that the more I try to get closer to violence, the less I understand it, and the closer I get, the more I see of violence. Ukraine was, as I said, one of my really first conflict, like real conflict. Before that, even if I worked in the Middle East, it was more, post-conflictual countries. But this time I really got to go as close as I could to violence, to brutality, to everything that is the worst you could find in human beings. And even after that, I still cannot understand it. And I think the closer I get and the less I understand it.
And as you say, you've also covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Are there any parallels between what you saw there and what you saw in Ukraine?
I think that's a very tough question because I don't think that even if every conflict kind of looks alike, in the end, everything is very different and very specific. I think the only thing that can be really seen as parallel is the fact that it's endless violence calling for more violence. I do think that the conflict in Palestine and Israel is something that is way, way, way more complex than anything else we can think about, and it's been going on for so many time and so much decades, and I think that the conflict in Ukraine is still so new, even if it really started in 2014 and not 2022. But it's just always a question of everything comes down in the end to violence, basically, and a game of powers and a game of aggression, and yeah.
And Chloe, how generally do people respond to you? You're taking images where they're at really some of the most difficult points in their life. How do they respond when they see you coming with a camera? Does it depend on where you are?
I think usually it's something that is very natural. So especially me, for example, I'm really not at ease taking pictures of people that are not okay with it. Usually we take pictures of people that are actually willing to share their stories. And I think it's something that is very natural that we can immediately feel. So if we see someone that's just turning around, turning their head, we're not going to take the picture. And usually we talk with those people as well. So we try to communicate with those people. We try to tell them why we're doing this. We tell them, we communicate with those people before. So for example, we see this picture right now of Artem, who was a very young guy in Kherson who was tortured by the Russians. This is not someone that I just took a picture on the street, for example. It's someone that we talked with. We had an interview with him. And I try as much as I can to respect the situation of the people, the vulnerability of the people. If in the end, if they are in a situation where they're not dignified and if they are vulnerable and not in a state of understanding why I'm taking the pictures, I try not to take it.
Okay, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there for now, Chloe. But thank you so much for joining us. That is award-winning photographer Chloe Sharrock.